Hello, thank you for joining me. My name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates, and this month we're talking about Mary Todd Lincoln, somebody that unfortunately is one of the most hated first ladies in history. I find her interesting, and I hope you'll learn a lot about her. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. Mary Ann Todd Lincoln was born on December 13th in 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was the fourth child of Robert Smith Todd and Elizabeth Eliza Parker. Both of her parents were considered among the state's most influential and politically connected elite families. She was from a very wealthy family. This is Mary's father here. In that portrait, her father was a merchant, a co-owner of a cotton mill, and he was president of the Lexington branch of the Bank of Kentucky. He was a clerk of the State House of Representatives for over 20 years, and he was later elected to a term in the Kentucky Senate. We know far less about Mary's mother, Elizabeth, known as Eliza Parker. She was the daughter of a prominent landowner and merchant, and she might have attended one of Lexington's elite female academies. Her father died in 1800, and her mother, also named Elizabeth Parker, stayed unmarried until her death in 1850. Elizabeth and Robert married in 1812, and they built a house beside Elizabeth Parker's home. They had 7 children: Elizabeth, Francis, Levi, Mary, Robert, Anne, and George. Robert died when he was a baby. Eliza in 1825 died from complications from George's birth, and Mary was only 6 at the time, and George will also die. So she lost her mother when she was only 6 years old. And by the way, I am in front of in the background here, you can see I'm in front of the Todd home, the home that Mary Ann Todd grew up in. One other thing I want to mention, I talk about her as Mary Todd Lincoln, but when she was alive and she was married to Lincoln, she just referred to herself as Mary Lincoln. I think the Todd got thrown in there because of her ties to the South, but you'll see. Mary's family played an integral role in the formation of Transylvania University and made sure that Mary received a solid education. And that is a very well-known university, by the way. Mary had almost 10 years of schooling. She followed 6 years of study at the Shelby Female Academy with 4 more years at Madame Charlotte Mantel's boarding school, a French boarding school. By that time, she had become fluent in French. And there's the Todd home there. And that's going to, I'll tell you about the lady in a second. The Todd home was largely maintained by enslaved men and women. As an adult, Mary came to oppose slavery. But when she was younger, I don't know if she ever thought about how morally wrong it was. Mary socialized with influential political guests. The most prominent was 3-time presidential candidate Henry Clay, who was beloved by many people, and he lived less than 2 miles away. And Robert Todd might have met his second wife, Elizabeth Betsy Humphreys, while working for the state legislature. Betsy's mother had moved her family from Virginia to Frankfort, Kentucky, after her husband's death to be near her siblings. Robert and Betsy married in 1826, and they had 9 children. Now think about all the children that there are here. Robert, who died as a baby, Margaret, Samuel, David, Martha, Emily, Alexander, Elodie, and Catherine. The year David was born, the Todds moved into a house on Main Street known as the Mary Todd Lincoln home. So we've got 8 children alive from that marriage, 7 from the others. That's 15. This is Mary's stepmother. To say that they weren't close would be an understatement. So you saw the picture, and you can still see the picture of the home that Mary moved to once her father married her stepmother. But here I want you to see, this is a recreation. It's a part of a national park of Abraham Lincoln's log cabin that he grew up in. He also had a stepmother. They were a very poor family, by the way, and his mother died, I think, when he was about 11. And his stepmother, he did have a wonderful relationship with. But you can see they're going to be coming from two very different backgrounds. But he loved his mother, he loved his stepmother. And I love, this is the oldest known picture of Mary. It's difficult to find pictures of her before she met Lincoln. It's believed that Mary didn't have a good relationship with her stepmother. Though Mary was physically well cared for and she did receive a good education, there was a lot of acrimony there. Though I think as she became an adult and got older and was in the White House, they did stay in touch, but I would never say that they were close. Mary remembered her childhood as desolate. And that's quoting her. That's pretty sad. In October 1839, Mary moved to Springfield, Illinois to live with her sister, Elizabeth Porter Edwards. Elizabeth was married to the son of a former governor of Illinois, Ninian Edwards. In Springfield, she was courted by several prominent politicians, including Stephen Douglas. Who does he go up against in a Senate race? The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of 7 public debates in 1858 between Republican Abraham Lincoln and incumbent Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas. And there's more about that out there. I've done about Lincoln's assassination. I haven't done about his life. I might do that in the future, but just keep on comparing the difference in their upbringing and their beliefs. Abraham Lincoln became friends with the Edwards, who owned a beautiful mansion, so her sister's family and her brother-in-law's family. They often had Sunday parties where the educated of society of Springfield gathered. There he met Mary Todd. Just 5'2" tall, she had clear blue eyes, long lashes, light brown hair, a lovely complexion. That's how she was described when she was younger. She was a graceful dancer. She loved jewelry, and she was very intelligent. Both Mary and Lincoln enjoyed politics and reading. That Mary was a family friend of Lincoln's idol, Henry Clay, made her even more desirable for Lincoln. So I truly do believe he loved her. But Lincoln had some other loves in his life too, and he had his heart broken at least one other time when his someone that he loved died, and maybe even a second time. But keep that in the back of your mind too. He has very mixed feelings. This is probably the oldest portrait of Lincoln. In 1840, when Mary was attending a social outing, she met Abraham Lincoln at one of the dances. He approached her and said, "I want to dance with you in the worst way." This is what they're saying. This seems very corny to me. Mary said, and he surely did. Catch the part about the worst way. I saw this several places, so I'm going to assume that it's true. It is very difficult to pierce together the true stories about Lincoln and Mary. It's not like today when every second of your life is being recorded. So I'd go with the most reliable sources and the ones that are repeated the most. At the time, Lincoln called himself a poor nobody. He grew up in a 1-room cabin. She lived in a 14-room mansion. 2 years after a stormy courtship and broken engagement, and he was very sad during that time, they were married on November 4th, 1842. Anne Rutledge, I believe, is the name of the one woman that he had his heart broken over when she passed away. The couple repeated their vows from the Book of Common Prayer. 1 week later, the groom wrote to a friend, writing that nothing new here except my marrying, which to me is a matter of profound wonder. And there he is. I think people often think that Mary wasn't pretty. I mean, I think that picture, not that there's looks are everything, but I think that picture shows she was an attractive woman, highly intelligent, perhaps a little volatile. And what I find, we don't really know what broke them up. That is one of the great mysteries. The stories really are not very reliable, but they had a disagreement about something, but they got back together. This is not very clear, but this is the marriage license for Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. And this is from the Papers of Abraham Lincoln Digital Library. And it said, to the minister of the gospel, authorized persons greeting. And it's signed. That's their marriage certificate that was signed. Now, remember, Mary is used to having clothing, having all her needs met. She grew up in a household where there were enslaved people. There aren't that in her sister's home in Illinois. And I think when she's having these political discussions, she's also becoming enlightened and taking a stand against slavery. They first lived in a boarding house that was part of the Globe Tavern, paying rent of $4 a week. So she's in a boarding house. Can you imagine? That's where you're going on your honeymoon. And Lincoln was a lawyer who went where the court was held. I mean, he didn't go to school to be a lawyer. Almost exactly 9 months after their wedding, their son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born, named after Mary's father. Then they moved to a 3-room cottage where the rent was $100 per year. But thanks to a gift from her father, and trust me, she had to wait a while for it, they were able to buy a 5-room Greek revival style home, which they eventually expanded. And that made Mary happy to have a home of her own and, have it be a little more upscale than living in a boarding house or the little 3-room place that they were living in. After Robert, Edward Baker Lincoln was born 2 years, but he is never a very strong baby. During this time, Lincoln completed his 4th term in the Illinois legislature. I would love to go to Springfield. I have never been there. I've gone to Ford's Theater, and I've gone to the home where Lincoln's body was taken after he was assassinated. And I've been to Mary Surratt's boarding house where the conspiracy was launched that would eventually assassinate Lincoln. But I would love to go see Springfield and everything that it has. It has a museum/library. It has his home. Abraham was defeated in his run for Congress in 1842, but won in 1846. He then lost the renomination in 1848 and was defeated for the U.S. Senate in 1854 and again in 1857. It makes me think of that song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. You ain't never going to keep me down, because he is not kept down. That would be enough to discourage most people. But his name starts getting out there. Mary Todd Lincoln's support, encouragement, and faith in him encouraged him to run for president. When he was in that 1 term of Congress, they lived in a boarding house in D.C. with 2 small boys and not many other women to associate with. And that was it for Mary. I think she thought it was going to be different. And that wasn't uncommon for people to have to live in boarding houses or nice hotels if they were wealthy. But after a few months, Mary moved to her father's home in Kentucky. And of course, she does have to deal with her stepmother there. And she does tell a story about her little boys, Robert bringing in a cat, and then her little son, Eddie, falling in love with the cat, and her stepmother, I can't remember what they called her, basically making the cat be thrown outside. In 1845, only 72 of the 221 members of the House were accompanied by family members, by the way, because who wants to live in a boarding house? Unless you're wealthy, as I said, and are living in a hotel. At the boarding house, Mary Lincoln was so retiring that she was rarely seen except at meals. Some boarders at Mrs. Sprague's boarding house, like those in the Globe Tavern 5 years earlier, found her disagreeable. On April 16, 1848, Lincoln wrote her saying that all the guests at Mrs. Sprague's, or rather all with whom you were decided good terms, send their love to you. The others say nothing. And yes, some of that was Mary. I think she could be prickly, and I think this was a big adjustment. But I also think that there were some people that perhaps weren't kind to her. Other congressional Lincoln had mixed feelings about his wife absence. He loved her. He loved being around his children. But there were, She didn't get along with people. She wasn't happy there. Some of the people, other congressional spouses may have envied Mary Lincoln her departure. One observed, I do not believe that Washington is very pleasant to any of the members' wives. I have conversed with several who I met, and all seem tired of it and wish to go home. It's different today, but I still think it's tough to have two homes if you don't have a lot of money. And that last part I took from the site A House Divided, as you can see. This story always breaks my heart. And this is Edward Baker Lincoln, and it was the second child of Abraham Lincoln and Mary. He was named after Lincoln's friend, Edward Dickinson Baker. Both Abraham and Mary spelled his name Eddy. However, the National Park Service uses Eddie, and his name is also spelled that way on his crypt at the Lincoln tomb. I think that's the only known picture of him. He was always sickly. His health was so fragile that Mary could not leave his side when her father became ill and died in July 1849. She said there was no time nor room to grieve. Then in December of that year, Edward Baker Lincoln's health got even worse. Edward only lived to be 3 years and 10 months old. After a lengthy illness suspected to be tuberculosis, he died in the Lincoln home in Springfield on February 1st, 1850. Lincoln referred to Eddie's death in a letter to his stepbrother, John D. Johnston, noting that Eddie was that was his stepmother's son, was sick 52 days, and we miss him very much. The Lincolns, and I just find absolutely heartbreaking anyone losing a child. I don't care if it was common, then your heart still broke. The Lincoln's next child, Willie, was born 10 months after Eddie's death. And I think you might recognize these two men. That's Lincoln. That's Stephen A. Douglas. And Lincoln, by the way, doesn't grow a beard until he becomes president, when a young lady writes him a letter and suggests that that would be a good idea. That's when the beard came into being. In February of 1855, Lincoln lost his bid for Senate when Illinois legislature elected Lyman Trumbull. That doesn't look like Lyman. Well, what happened? In June 1858, was chosen as a U.S. Senate candidate by the Illinois Republican Convention. He had originally been a Whig, W-H-I-G. That party doesn't exist today. In August, he began the first of 7 debates with Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. So this is a different Senate race than the other one he ran for. In November, he won the popular Senate vote, but lost the election to Douglas. During this time, he was away from home a lot. When he was home, Mary would wine and dine important visitors, especially those of importance in the Republican Party. And that time period, the Republican Party would have been considered the more liberal, the more caring of people. It was just a very different time. And Lincoln had run for those other offices as a Whig. Keep that in mind as well. So there's Stephen Douglas, and we have Lincoln tall and thin, Douglas short and a little stout, perhaps. And Mary knew how the importance of making political connections. And this is from the Miller Center, an essay about the First Lady. And there she is with her 2 sons at the time. Mary was, and that's Willie on the right, Robert on the left. Mary was supportive of her husband entering the race for president in 1860. Mary was always available for comment on her husband's policies or prospects, and she was a willing tour guide of the Lincoln home and was an advisor to her husband, discussing the political prospects of his competitors, some of whom were her former boyfriends or beaux. It was Mary who fired Abraham Lincoln's political ambitions. Her involvement was so integral that when Lincoln won in November the election for president, not for Senate. He lost to Stephen Douglas. So realize he had only won one election. He had won a congressional seat as a Whig one time and then lost it. So then he's going to become president, but he ran enough for Senate, for Congress, and other things. Mary, we are elected. So it was like they both were going to be in president. Mary Todd Lincoln was thrilled to become the First Lady, a term that had recently entered the American lexicon to describe the president's partner. Now, realize that before this, the last president, Buchanan, had been a bachelor, and his very pretty young niece, Harriet Lane, I believe, was beloved, and she's filled that role. I don't, as First Lady, but this is Mary is really the first person that's going to actually have the title of First Lady. And actually, if I went back, I think that's actually Willie and Tad. They had another child, and Tad was named that because they thought he looked a little bit like a tadpole when he was young. And this is from Wikipedia, the map of, we've got 4 people running for president then. Lincoln is the peach color. Douglas is the blue. That's not the popular vote. That's the how many votes they got from the Electoral College. Breckinridge was the green. Can you guess that he was most likely a Southerner? And Bell is the orangey color. The election of 1860 was one of the most important presidential Lincoln elections in American history. I would say up to that time, it was the most important. It pitted Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln against Democratic Party nominee Senator Stephen Douglas, Southern Democratic Party nominee, separate from the regular Democratic Party. And that was a pro-slavery group, John Breckinridge, and Constitutional Union Party nominee John Bell. The main issue of the election was slavery and states' rights. Lincoln was victorious and became the 16th president of the United States, leading to a national crisis that would rip states and families apart and test Lincoln's leadership. And that was the Civil War. By the time, and they knew that Lincoln was anti-slavery or anti-enslavement. By the time Lincoln was sworn in as president, 7 states had seceded from the Union, and eventually there will be 11. They thought there would be maybe 2 more, but that never happened. But there were some states that were kind of on the line, states that had, for example, Maryland. They had people from the Confederacy and Union. I'm going to move this. The Lincolns moved into the White House in March of 1861, and Mary began refurbishing the rundown building. Newspapers covered her shopping trips, and some in Washington were displeased when she exceeded the $20,000 congressional appropriation for the project. Others praised the redecorated White House. And let me explain something to you. Buchanan and whoever was before him for the past few years, nobody had done anything. It was threadbare, it was rundown, it was dirty, it had rats. That's an ongoing problem. And Mary, yes, the White House definitely needed to be redone, redecorated. Some people thought she got carried away and didn't stop. Some people were critical of her spending. The Civil War began a few weeks after his inauguration, and Mary decided to stay in Washington despite a general's advice to the contrary. That is pretty brave because Virginia's right there, Maryland's right there. Could the Confederate government even come through to Washington and seize it? It's a pretty dangerous area, and lots of soldiers are stationed there. She attended military demonstrations and visited army camps with the president. She volunteered in Union hospitals and donated to sanitary fairs, supplies that are for hospitals and people in need. There's the U.S. Sanitary Commission. She supported the Contraband Relief Association, started by her dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, to help enslaved men and women who had escaped to Washington. And they were referred to, unfortunately, at that time as contraband. And this is her dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley. And she and Mary were very close. She is a Black woman, and I think that she also helped open Mary's eyes to what enslavement involved, helped enslavement involve people. Affected everyone. I'm not wording that right. Mary became more aware. Let me say that. And this is a pretty amazing woman herself. Largely ignored by the press at the time, Mary contributed quietly but significantly to the war effort. And lots of times Elizabeth Keckley was with her. She visited wounded and soldiers in the hospital and helped care for them. Many of the hospitals around the District of Columbia, as well as attending events with Lincoln to review the troops. In August of 1864, during a visit to Campbell Hospital, she spent time with one soldier, James Egan, and subsequently wrote the following letter to his mother. My dear Mrs. Egan, I'm sitting by the son of your soldier boy. He has been quite sick, but is getting well. He tells me to say to you that he's all right, with respect for the mother of the young soldier, Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Remember, this is a different time. So she referred to herself by her husband's name. I just put the Mrs. in front. According to James, he wasn't aware that it was Mrs. Lincoln visiting him at the Campbell Hospital, so she didn't make a big show of it, and she did it quietly. He later claimed the same woman visited him twice. The first time she brought him flowers, and the second time she wrote to his mother. He only discovered his visitor was the First Lady after he returned home, and his mother showed him the letter. This is one of the few letters that Mary Lincoln wrote that remained. And her position as First Lady was a difficult one due to her Southern birth and the fact that some of her brothers, her half-brothers, were fighting for the Confederacy. And Mrs. Lincoln does, I can't completely defend her. I mean, she got some very elaborate china, so a new set of china. And then there's like dresses, and she wants to be in a certain style because she is the wife of the president. And there was problems that there were disagreements about money. But remember, she's accustomed to wealth. And she does have a dressmaker that can make some of her outfits. Both Willie and Tad contracted typhoid fever. So there's Robert standing up in that picture. That's a drawing. There's Willie sitting in the front. There's Tad next to his father. There's Mary. There's Lincoln. And there's the beard of Lincoln. But they contracted typhoid fever. And there's Willie right there. On February 20th, 1862, Willie died of typhoid fever. And most often, typhoid comes from contaminated water, which you wouldn't think the White House would have that issue, but it definitely did during that time period. And the White House was draped in black crepe. And Willie's funeral took place in the East Room. But Mrs. Lincoln was unable to attend. Elizabeth Keckley, she actually has a book out. She would be an interesting person to research as well. But this is what she says. Mrs. Lincoln's grief was inconsolable. The pale face of her dead boy threw her into convulsions, and she turned to spiritualism, and she had seances in the Red Room, which also opened her up to criticism, but her heart was broken. This is the second child she and the president have lost. Can you imagine? And there he is. There's Willie. Mary's concern about the safety of her children showed in her willingness to allow Robert to enlist. As men were giving their lives on the battlefield, Robert was at Harvard University. And he actually also attended a preparatory school in New Hampshire. I, I think it was called Exeter Academy then, but it is known as Phillips Exeter Academy today. So Abraham Lincoln visited that small New Hampshire town. But Robert was very bright, but it took him a while to get into Harvard. But both of his parents would not allow him to enlist. And one response to any mention of it, Mary said, "We have lost one son, and his loss is as much as I can bear without being called upon to make another sacrifice. I cannot bear to have Robert exposed to danger. His services are not required in the field, and sacrifice would be a needless one." Um, Let me mention a couple of things before this is over. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, there's a scene in it. And oh my goodness, Sally Field did a great job. The actor Daniel Day-Lewis, who played Lincoln, was phenomenal, by the way. But there is a scene that shows Lincoln when Robert's telling his father he wants to go to war. His father slapped him. Lincoln and Mary were very much non-disciplinarians. In fact, their children were thought to run kind of wild. They ran wild through the White House. There is no way he would have ever slapped him. There's a little elaboration here or there. There's a scene in the beginning where he's chatting with some of the black troops. I'm not sure that they were called the U.S. colored troops. I'm not sure if that ever happened. I would have to research that more. But honestly, it is a great movie to get and to give you the feeling of what the White House was like. It was kind of gloomy and dark. And I think that goes along with what was happening in the country. And also, they had lost a child. So, because the movie is about the passage of the 13th Amendment. Anyways, it was an Academy Award winning film. Check it out. And there's a great PBS series called something called The House Divided, which is about Mary and Lincoln as well. Mary, however, would disguise her concern for safety with other reasons, telling one senator that Robert had not enlisted in the army because I have insisted that he should stay in college a little longer, as I think a more educated man can serve his country with more intelligent purpose than an ignoramus. Although remaining in college might have been another reason for him to stay out of the war, Mary's main concern was the possibility of death. I can't blame her. But people are saying Lincoln is sending their children off to war. She didn't want to lose another child. If he had died in the army, Mary would have blamed herself. Did he want to go? Absolutely. Just as she did with Willie's death. While she had a deep sadness for mothers that lost their children, Mary was determined not to join their ranks. In spite of all this, Robert eventually joined the army. It was near the end of the war. He was on General Grant's staff, meaning his chances of seeing combat were slim because this is the end of the war. I'm not saying that Grant wasn't in the thick of it, but he does go. Of 13 surviving full and half siblings, 8 supported the Confederacy. Mary's brother George Todd and 3 half brothers, excuse me, Alexander, David, and Samuel, served in the Confederate Army. Alexander was killed in the Battle of Baton Rouge, which would be in Louisiana. Samuel was killed in the Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee, and Robert was wounded at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Robert David was wounded at Vicksburg. In September of 1863, Mary's brother-in-law, 32-year-old Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin Hardin Helm, was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia. Helm had married Emily Todd, Mary's younger half-sister, and by the way, they were very close. The husbands of her half-sisters, Martha White and Elodie Dawson, were ardent supporters of the Confederacy. The Todds themselves were a house divided. Looking out for Lincoln's best interests, Mary was known for her suspicions of the powerful men around Lincoln. Mary particularly distrusted Secretary Seward. And let me interject here for a minute. Doris Goodwin has written a book that I really enjoy called Team of Rivals. It was partially the basis for the Lincoln movie with Daniel Day-Lewis. And you can learn a lot more. Lincoln drew the people that ran against him closer. Among those was Seward, Salmon Chase. There's a lot. Pick up the book. You'll enjoy it. Mary distrusted Secretary Seward, and there would be people that would say that perhaps the person she really shouldn't have trusted was Stanton. There are people that believed that he was part of the assassination plot. I cannot say that I know anything about that, but that is out there. In addition to Seward, Mary did not like or trust the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase. I can understand why. He was not a very pleasant fellow. She didn't like Vice President Andrew Johnson. Remember, he's a new vice president. Lincoln is just going to be getting reelected when he becomes vice president. Before that, it was Hannibal Hamilton. And she didn't trust George McClellan. Yeah, I can understand that. George McClellan wasn't exactly a go-getter as a Union general, or she didn't like Ulysses S. Grant either. Grant originally had a very bad reputation as a drinker. I think Grant ends up being a phenomenal general. So Mary either viewed these men as rivals to her husband or ones that would not provide a Union victory. The power that Mary had in Lincoln's administration led her ambition to be seen as a liability to Lincoln's presidency, creating internal and external tensions with the government and the public. While Lincoln called the shots during his presidency and regarding the war, Mary was next to him, supporting, advising, and influencing him. And she's a smart woman. Don't think that she was not. She was an essential political partner. I bet you all recognize Grant here. That's McClellan. This is Seward. I think this is Salmon Chase. I could go through all this, but read Team Arrivals. Do research and dig on your own. My belief is that, well, we don't need to talk about the assassination. I did that one already. So I think Mary gets a bum rap some of the time. She did overspend. She could be. I think people would have said high strung, but I think she was in a really tough position. And the White House, people could just walk up and ask to see the president. What kind of place is that? And did it need to be fixed up? For sure. Lincoln won the election in 1864, and guess who runs against him? McClellan, the general. And with Union victories, it looked like the war would end in his second term. And there was a plot at one point to kidnap Lincoln instead of kill Lincoln, but that didn't happen. And by the way, when the Lincolns were in DC, and it was so brutal and hot and miserable, sometimes they would go to the soldiers' home, which was near where it was a little place outside of Washington where it was much cooler. And it's a place you can visit today, along with Ford's Theater and the home where he was taken after he was assassinated. Those are run by the National Park Service. And of course, you can go to Springfield. And I do have a digital discussion on Lincoln's assassination that you can find on YouTube if you're interested. But by the way, when Lincoln's giving his inaugural address, John Wilkes Booth is in the audience there. And just a few weeks after his second inauguration and days after the Confederate surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse, and remember, people were sworn in as president in March at that time, not January, John Wilkes Booth fired a fatal shot at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln died the following morning. And this is a drawing of what happened. And actually, it was Grant and his wife that were supposed to be with them. They couldn't. They had to go to something for their son, or maybe they didn't. Julia didn't particularly like Mary Lincoln. So Major Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris, were there with the Lincolns when John Wilkes Booth easily, because Lincoln's guard had stepped away, he easily gets in there and assassinates Lincoln. Lincoln's taken to a boarding house. The bed is so small that he has to kind of lay crosswise. And Mary Todd Lincoln paced the parlor by herself. Some of the time, Clara was with her. She was in the room some, but Stanton, and I will say this, I found absolutely appalling. She had witnessed the assassination of her husband. Now she was thrown out of the bedroom by a furious Secretary of War, Stanton, who kicked her out of the room when she began to cry hysterically. So what? Different people came and went. I believe there were about 12 people around his bedside when he passed away. Nearby, her husband was dying, but she couldn't be in there because Stanton wanted her to get herself under control. Her son, Robert, also would come there. He was in the room, but Mary didn't get to be in the room with her husband. I feel like Stanton overstepped. She wasn't there to be with him when he died. Here's Mary. Mary, in shock, isolated herself at the White House, cared for by Elizabeth Keckley, who, this is a quote from Keckley's book, soothed the terrible tornado as best I could. Mary stayed in her rooms at the White House for 5 weeks and did not accompany her husband's remains on the funeral procession to Springfield, Illinois. So at this point, she's lost 2 sons and 1 husband. What do people think? She saw no one socially, but took comfort in her sons and a few close friends. And she's going to wear black, by the way, for the rest of her life. She finally left the White House after about 5 weeks. She was dressed and boarded a train with Robert, Tad, Keckley, and 2 guards. And she was dressed in black as she would be for the rest of her 17 years of life. She moved from the White House to Chicago on May 23rd, 1865. And she and her son, Tad, moved to Frankfurt, Germany in 1868 after attending the wedding of Robert Lincoln to Mary Herlan in Washington, D.C. While Tad attended school, Mary traveled in Germany and France. On Saturday morning, July 15th, 1871, Tad died at the age of 18 at Clifton House Hotel in Chicago. The cause of the death has been referred to as a tuberculosis, a pleuritic attack, pneumonia, or congestive heart failure. Mary has lost another son. She only has 1 child alive. How much is that to bear, along with her husband's death? Funeral services were held for him at his brother Robert's home in Chicago. His body was transported to Springfield and buried in the Lincoln tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery alongside his father and 2 brothers. Robert accompanied the casket on the train, but Mary was too distraught to make the trip. As the widow of the assassinated president, there she is in black, the first in the nation's history where she received some public sympathy. At first, she was only paid by Congress the balance of Lincoln's $25,000 per year salary, which what I think was there was 21,000 something left. There was no provision for widows at that time. In 1870, Congress finally granted her a pension of $3,000, finally raising it to $5,000 in 1881. And she considered the sum inadequate. I mean, she had a lot of debt when she left the White House, too. And she did not have a way to support herself. While sightseeing in Florida, in 1875, Mary had a premonition that led to one of the most difficult periods of her life. She was in Florida, but she became convinced that Robert was sick. She rushed to Chicago, where Robert, who was healthy, began to question his mother's mental health. She was not herself. She would say some nonsensical things. And after observing her and consulting with the doctors and friends, he decided that she needed to be placed in an asylum. Was she not herself? Sure. Was she having some ideas that maybe could have been incorrect? Perhaps. Certainly, Robert was healthy, but he wanted his mother to go to the asylum where she could rest and recover. Illinois law required a jury trial, a public trial, to determine sanity instead of a private trial. People that are committed to psychiatric facilities today, if they don't voluntarily go, usually there's a 48 or 72-day hold, and then they appear privately, at least in my home state, in front of a judge. A lot of times there's not enough to keep them. But this is what happens to Mary. There's this trial. It takes her to court in May of 1875. It lasted 3 hours. Witnesses for the prosecution testified that Mary shopped excessively, complained about strange pains, and was obsessed with imagined dangers. I don't know what she had for a defense, but a jury of 12 men, yes, no women, because they weren't even voting, they certainly weren't on juries, ruled that she was insane and appointed Robert as conservator of her estate. Mary, who did not know about the trial until that day, sat quietly through the hearing. And there's a picture of it right there. I think she was treated very disrespectfully. Do I think she had some issues? Yes. There's people today that diagnose her and say that she was bipolar. I don't think we can ever know that. She was taken by Robert to Bellevue Place, not in New York. This is the Bellevue Sanitarium in Batavia, Illinois. During her 3-month stay there, she cooperated with staff. Some people believe she was awarded some extra privileges because of who she was, but she wrote letters to her friends asking them to help with her release. And in September of 1875, she was released to the care of her sister, Elizabeth. Remember the place where she met Lincoln, in Springfield, Illinois. In September of 1876, Mary sailed for Europe, and she lived in Pau, France for several years. And she's going to be estranged from her son for the rest of his life and her life, excuse me. After hurting her back in a fall, she returned to the United States in 1880. She was afflicted by health issues, and she stayed in 2 rooms of her sister Elizabeth's home in Springfield. On July 15th, 1882, the anniversary of Tad's death, Mary collapsed and fell into a coma. And this is a street sign, one of those panels, a different shape, but we have them here as well. But it talks about Mary Lincoln's ring. And so what it says here, this is in Springfield, Lincoln said, "Love is eternal," and it was inscribed on the inside of her wedding band. It was given to her when they were married on November 4th, 1842. And so if you're walking the streets of Springfield, you'd be able to read signs like that are near their home. But before her death, Mary had removed her wedding ring from her finger. On July 16th, 1882, she had passed away in her sister's home, the same home where she had married Lincoln 40 years before she passed away. The following day, some of Elizabeth's friends found the ring and discovered that the inscription didn't just say, "Love is eternal." They said it also said, "A.L. to Mary, November 4th, 1842. The ring was returned to Mary's finger where it had been for almost 40 years. And of course, we'll never know now if it had those additional words, but we do know that it said love is eternal. There's Mary again in black. Mary's legacy as a first lady is portrayed as a first lady who went insane. Yes, Mary had issues. She had spending issues. She lost so many children. She had some mental health issues, but she was also a first lady that cared about the soldiers. She spent a lot of time and the families that were impacted by the war. I don't think she gets some of the credit that she deserves. One of my favorite places to go is the Smithsonian, the one of Museum of American History. They have the First Lady's gowns out. Not all of them. When I first visited there, you could see every First Lady gown. And sometimes they're not even like their gowns that they wore at the inauguration, but they're other pictures as well, and they rotate. So I don't know if Mary's gown is out, the section that's devoted to her, but that's one of the most interesting areas of the museum for me. And I do think that Mary deserves a better legacy. So what's interesting, I think maybe the dress styles and what she had to bear. Sometimes people think she was a lot older than she was. She was in her late 40s when she was in the White House. Sally Field, who played her, was in her late 60s. So read more about Mary Lincoln. There's a lot of books. The most recent one I could find was from 2009. And a lot of websites that have a lot more information. The Lincoln Museum, the home, so many more places you can look and get more information. Okay, here's interesting. I don't know if you watched the Tony Awards this year. The show is based on Mary Lincoln. It is absolute, total fiction. Some people love it, some people hate it. But I thought I would mention it. You can see that's supposed to be Lincoln and Mary. And I took this from a review of it on the Huffington Post. And it says, Cole Escalola's first play on Broadway has earned them one of the most coveted prizes in the theater world. At this year's Tony Awards, the star of Old Mary, Oh Mary, not Old Mary, scored the Tony Award for Best Performance by an actor and a leading role in a play for the delightfully daffy depiction of the Civil War era First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. Oh Mary is a campy revisionist one-act play set in the days leading up to President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and it paints the First Lady as a petulant, puckish troublemaker who tries to drink her woes away. I don't think there's any basis for that at all. She yearns to leave the White House to become a cabaret star. Last month, Escola, who was not only the lead of Oh Mary, but also penned the crowd pleaser, told National Public Radio how they related to the First Lady and her offbeat ambitions. This play is about a woman with a dream that no one around her understands, a dream that the whole world is telling her is stupid and doesn't make any sense. And I feel that way. And there's that. So I'll let you decide if it ever travels to this area, or if you want to go see it on Broadway. Realize that it's absolute, total fantasy fiction. And here's the Lincoln family tree. And there's Mary Todd, and there's their children, only one of whom survives. Robert Todd has children. Those children have children. And then Lincoln's great-grandson doesn't die till 1985, but guess what? None of them have children. The Lincoln line is gone. Now I will go here to this person right there, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, and I will tell you that he said he never had children. But his second wife here says that there was a child, but they had, I don't know if they got what happened, if it's not true that he was their father, if it was like maybe she was paid to not pursue that claim. So maybe there's somebody that's a descendant of Lincoln. Maybe there isn't. I don't know enough about it, but this is from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. But officially, there are no Lincolns left, not even people with Lincoln blood, not Lincoln last name, because that wouldn't happen here anyway. But that is it. that is it. The line is gone, which I find extremely sad. These are my sources. I do hope I've inspired you to do some more research on Mary Todd Lincoln. This is the most recent book about her. Thank you. Read more about Lincoln, read more about Mary Todd, and thank you so much. I appreciate you all.